What does it take to become the richest person in modern history? Is it raw genius, relentless, backbreaking work? Or is it a willingness to burn down everything and everyone in your path? The story of John D. Rockefeller is the story of a man who was both a saint and a sinner, a devout Baptist who built a fortune on deception and a titan of industry who became the world's greatest philanthropist. This isn't just a story about money, it's a story about power, the birth of modern capitalism, and a dynasty that would change the world forever. From the son of a traveling con man to the head of the world's first billionaire family, John D. Rockefeller's life is a masterclass in brutal ambition and ice-cold strategy. The company he created, Standard Oil, became the stuff of legend, an octopus with its tentacles wrapped around the neck of an entire nation. And yet, this is the same man who would spend the last 40 years of his life giving that fortune away, funding medical breakthroughs that saved millions, and building universities that would shape the 20th century. How did one man manage to control 90% of America's oil, build a fortune that would dwarf any of today's tech billionaires, and leave behind a legacy so complex that, a century later, we are still debating his soul? This is the story of how a traveling salesman's son built an empire that defined an era and a dynasty that continues to shape our lives today. To understand the man who would master the world of money, you have to understand the two forces that forged him: his father, the devil, and his mother, the saint. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in a small house in Richford, New York. His world was one of sharp contrasts. His mother, Eliza, was a devout Baptist, the anchor of the family. She was a woman of incredible discipline and thrift who raised her children on the principles of work, saving, and charity. It was Eliza who taught young John his first and most important financial lesson: to always give a portion of his earnings to the church. It was a habit he kept for the rest of his life, even when he was only making a few dollars a week. And then there was his father, William Avery Rockefeller, better known as Big Bill, or more darkly, Devil Bill. Bill Rockefeller was a traveling salesman, a showman who wandered the countryside selling miracle cures and herbal remedies. He was charismatic and flashy, but he was also a cheat, a bigamist, and a con artist. He would vanish for months at a time, living a second life with another family, only to reappear with huge wads of cash from questionable sources. Devil Bill's business lessons were cruel. He once bragged, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make 'em sharp." He would trick his own sons in trades, always making sure he came out on top. These were brutal, formative lessons. From his mother, John learned to save every penny. From his father, he learned the art of the deal and a deep suspicion of other people. It was a strange education, a mix of pious morality and cutthroat cynicism. The boy who came out of this was serious, quiet, and incredibly methodical. He wasn't a brilliant student, but he had a special gift, a near-supernatural talent for numbers. He could solve complex math problems in his head with shocking speed, a skill that would come in handy. His ambition started young. As a boy, he started raising and selling turkeys for a nice profit. He saved his money carefully, and by age 12, he had $50. In a moment that would define his future, he loaned that money to a local farmer at 7% interest. A year later, when the farmer paid him back with interest, Rockefeller had an epiphany. He later said, "The impression was gaining ground with me, that it was a good thing to let the money be my servant and not make myself a slave to the money." In 1853, the family moved near Cleveland, Ohio, looking for better opportunities. For John, this was the first step out of his chaotic family life and into a world where his unique skills could finally be put to the test. He was no longer just Devil Bill's son. He was a young man with a ledger, a dream, and a solid belief that God wanted him to be rich. In the summer of 1855, A serious 16-year-old John D. Rockefeller walked the streets of Cleveland, Ohio, looking for a job. He wasn't looking for just any job. He wanted in at a respectable firm where he could learn how business really worked. For 6 straight weeks, he visited every major business in the city, banks, railroad companies, you name it, and was rejected every single time. Business was slow, and nobody wanted to hire a teenager with no experience. But Rockefeller didn't give up. Finally, on September 26, 1855, he was hired as an assistant bookkeeper at a small produce firm called Hewitt and Tuttle. The pay was almost nothing, but to Rockefeller it meant everything. He would call this date Job Day and celebrate it more than his own birthday for the rest of his life. He was in. He threw himself into the work with a passion that bordered on obsession. He was meticulous, precise, and completely reliable. He studied every entry in the company's books, checking for errors, learning how the money flowed, and getting a feel for the rhythm of commerce. His bosses were blown away by his focus. It was here he started his first personal ledger, a small red book he called Ledger A, where he wrote down every single penny he earned and spent. This book was his Bible, detailing his small salary, his donations to the church, and his personal savings. It was proof of his mother's lessons in discipline. Rockefeller wasn't just working, he was studying. He analyzed shipping costs, market prices, and profit margins. He learned the value of credit, the danger of debt, and the power of having cash on hand. While other young men were out spending their money, Rockefeller was saving. His goal, which seemed impossible at the time, was to save up $100,000. By 1859, at just 20 years old, he had saved enough and learned enough to make his move. With a partner, Morris B. Clark, he started his own commission business. They dealt in hay, grain, meat, and other goods. Their timing was perfect. The American Civil War broke out, creating a massive demand for supplies, and their business boomed. Rockefeller's cautious nature balanced his partner's more daring side. He stayed away from risky bets and focused on solid, profitable deals. It was around this time that a new industry was exploding in nearby Pennsylvania. Men were drilling holes in the ground and finding black liquid gold, petroleum. The oil rush was on, a wild and chaotic frenzy. Most people saw it as a gamble, a get-rich-quick scheme that would eventually crash. But John D. Rockefeller, the careful bookkeeper, saw something else. He didn't see the chaos of the oil fields. He saw the future. He realized that while drilling for oil was a lottery, refining it into kerosene for lamps was a stable, essential business. In 1863, he and his partners invested in their first oil refinery. It was a small step, but it was the most important decision of his life. He was about to leave the world of produce behind and enter an industry that he wouldn't just dominate, he would define it. The mid-19th century oil boom was the Wild West all over again. A mad scramble for wealth in the hills of Pennsylvania and Ohio. Prospectors and speculators flooded the region, hoping to strike it rich. Towns popped up overnight, and fortunes were made and lost in a day. The industry was volatile, wasteful, and brutally competitive, and into this storm walked John D. Rockefeller, a man who hated chaos more than anything. His goal was simple and bold, to bring order. His method, however, would be anything but. In 1870, Rockefeller, along with his brother William Henry Flagler and a chemist named Samuel Andrews, incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with $1 million in capital. At the time, they were just one of many refineries in Cleveland, but Rockefeller had a vision he called Our Plan. It was a plan to control not just a piece of the oil industry, but the entire thing. His first big move was so fast and so brutal, it became known as the Cleveland Massacre. In early 1872, Rockefeller set out to systematically wipe out his competition in the city. His weapon wasn't violence, it was economics. He secretly struck a deal with the major railroads to get huge discounts or rebates on shipping costs for his oil. This gave Standard Oil an edge no one could match. His competitors, who had to pay the much higher public rates, simply couldn't sell their oil cheaply enough to compete. Armed with this power, Rockefeller went to the 26 other refiners in Cleveland with an ultimatum. Sell your company to me at a fair price, or I will drive you into bankruptcy. A few tried to fight, but most saw it was a hopeless battle. In just 6 weeks, Standard Oil had swallowed up 22 of its 26 local rivals. It was a stunning show of strategic aggression. Rockefeller justified it as a necessary evil to end wasteful competition and create efficiency. He famously said, "Competition is a sin." This was the start of his strategy of horizontal integration, controlling one entire level of an industry. But Rockefeller didn't stop there. He then moved on to vertical integration, controlling every single step of the oil business. Standard Oil bought forests for wood to make its own barrels, built its own plants to assemble them, and bought its own pipelines and railroad tank cars to move the oil. By controlling the entire supply chain, Rockefeller could slash costs and crush anyone who dared to stand in his way. To manage this sprawling empire, Rockefeller and his partners created a new corporate structure, the Trust. In 1882, they formed the Standard Oil Trust, a legal entity that held the shares of all the companies they controlled. This allowed a small group of 9 trustees, led by Rockefeller, to centrally manage a massive network of companies across the country. Getting around state laws meant to limit corporate power. As the journalist Ida Tarbell later wrote, "You could argue its existence from its effects, but you could not prove it." Standard Oil's tactics were legendary for their ruthlessness. The company used spies to get information on competitors, engaged in predatory pricing, selling oil at a loss in one town to bankrupt a local rival, then jacking prices back up, and even set up fake competitor companies to create the illusion of a free market. By the 1880s, the results were clear. Standard Oil had become the first great industrial monopoly in the world. It controlled about 90% of the oil refining business in the United States. John D. Rockefeller, the quiet bookkeeper from Cleveland, was now the master of an empire, the most powerful and feared industrialist in America. But as his power grew, so did the list of his enemies. The public was starting to wake up to the giant octopus that had its tentacles around the American economy, and a storm was brewing. By the late 1880s, the name Standard Oil was spoken with a mix of awe and fear. The company was a symbol of American power, a perfect machine that brought cheap kerosene to the masses, lighting up homes across the nation. But it was also seen as a heartless predator, a monopoly that had crushed small businesses and rigged the free market. Political cartoons showed Standard Oil as a monster octopus, its tentacles reaching from the oil fields all the way to the halls of Congress. The term robber baron was created for men like Rockefeller, captains of industry who built huge fortunes through what many saw as unethical means. That simmering public anger was about to find its champion in a new wave of investigative journalists known as muckrakers. And no one would prove to be a tougher opponent for Rockefeller than Ida M. Tarbell. Tarbell wasn't just a journalist, this was personal. Her father had been an independent oil man in Pennsylvania, one of the many small businessmen whose lives were ruined by Standard Oil's march to dominance. In 1902, McClure's magazine began publishing her explosive series, The History of the Standard Oil Company. It was a sensation. In 19 parts, Tarbell laid bare the secret history of Rockefeller's empire. She used court records, government reports, and interviews to expose the secret railroad deals, the predatory pricing, and the systematic campaign to destroy rivals. Tarbell's writing wasn't just angry, it was cold, factual, and devastating. She painted Rockefeller not as a simple villain, but as a brilliant and calculating strategist, a modern Napoleon of commerce whose ambition had no moral brakes. Her work gave the public the proof it had been looking for, confirming their worst fears about the unchecked power of the trusts. The history of the Standard Oil Company is now seen as a landmark of investigative journalism, and it completely changed the national conversation about big business. Fueled by Tarbell's articles and growing public outrage, the government finally decided to act. The Sherman Antitrust Act had been passed in 1890, but it was rarely used. Now, under President Theodore Roosevelt, the man who actually coined the term muckraker, the federal government was ready for a fight. In 1906, the US government filed a massive lawsuit against Standard Oil, accusing it of being an illegal monopoly. The legal battle was epic, dragging on for years. The government presented a mountain of evidence, much of it dug up by Tarbell, detailing decades of anti-competitive behavior. Standard Oil fought back, arguing it had won through superior efficiency, not illegal tactics, and that it had ultimately helped consumers by making kerosene cheap. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. On May 15, 1911, the court delivered its historic decision. It ruled that Standard Oil was, in fact, an unreasonable monopoly and that its practices illegally restrained trade. The court ordered the complete breakup of the mighty Standard Oil Trust. The empire John D. Rockefeller had spent 40 years building was to be shattered into 34 separate companies. The octopus had been killed, or so it seemed. The world's most hated man was about to get the surprise of his life, a final, ironic twist that would make him the first billionaire in history. The breakup of Standard Oil in 1911 was celebrated as a huge victory for the little guy, a sign that the government could take on unchecked corporate power. John D. Rockefeller, now in his 70s and long retired from running the company, had been defeated. But a funny thing happened. The government's biggest blow against him would, ironically, make him richer than anyone could possibly imagine. The Supreme Court had ordered the trust to be broken up, but the ownership of the new companies remained the same. As the largest shareholder of the parent company, Rockefeller received a huge chunk of stock in each of the 34 newly independent companies, firms that would become giants in their own right. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and others. Before the breakup, the true value of Standard Oil was hidden inside the complex trust. Now, as these 34 companies started trading on the open market, their individual stock prices shot through the roof. Investors finally saw the immense value that had been locked away. For John D. Rockefeller, the result was a financial windfall of epic proportions. His personal fortune, mated at around $300 million before the ruling, exploded. In 1916, newspapers made it official. John D. Rockefeller was the world's first documented billionaire. At its peak, his fortune was nearly $900 million, which at the time was almost 3% of the entire US economy. To put that in perspective, if one person held that same share of the US economy today, their net worth would be in the hundreds of billions, far more than any current billionaire. The man the government tried to cut down to size had become the richest human in modern history. But as his wealth hit its peak, Rockefeller was already deep into the second act of his life. The ruthless monopolist was transforming himself into a trailblazing philanthropist. This change was driven by a lot of things. It was partly rooted in his lifelong Baptist faith and the lessons on tithing his mother taught him. He was also pushed by his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and his trusted advisor, Frederick T. Gates, who told him to apply the same grand scale and efficiency to giving away money as he did to making it. Of course, many people believed this was all just a massive PR campaign to clean up his dirty reputation and protect his fortune from taxes. Whatever the reason, the scale was mind-blowing. He had already founded the University of Chicago in 1890 and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in 1901. But his masterpiece came in 1913 when he established the Rockefeller Foundation with an initial gift of $100 million. Its mission was simple and enormous: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. This wasn't just charity, it was scientific philanthropy on a global scale. The foundation didn't just hand out cash, It attacked problems at their root. It funded a campaign that practically wiped out hookworm, a nasty parasite that plagued the American South. It launched a global war on yellow fever, funding the research that led to a vaccine. It poured millions into education and public health, basically professionalizing the field of medicine and creating a new blueprint for large-scale giving. By the time he died, John D. Rockefeller had given away more than $500 million, about half of his total fortune. The same man who once said, "Competition is a sin," was now funding the very institutions that would foster discovery for generations. The creator of the world's most feared monopoly had become the father of modern philanthropy. This deep contradiction is the heart of his legacy, a puzzle we are still trying to solve a century later. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, just before his 98th birthday. He had lived long enough to see the world transformed from horse and buggy to cars and airplanes, a world powered by the oil he had mastered. But his death wasn't the end of the story. He had built not just a company, but a dynasty, and he had carefully trained his only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., to take over. If the father was the great accumulator of wealth, the son dedicated his life to giving it away and cementing the family's civic legacy. John D. Rockefeller Jr. managed the family's philanthropy with the same seriousness his father had applied to business. He was behind projects that would define the American landscape. During the Great Depression, he funded the construction of Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, a massive project that created 75,000 jobs. He donated the land for the United Nations headquarters. His love for conservation led to the creation of national parks like Grand Teton and Acadia. The Rockefeller name, once a synonym for monopoly, became linked with philanthropy, art, and public service. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, John Jr.'s wife, was a key force behind the creation of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Their 5 sons, known as the Brothers, each found their own way to be influential. Nelson Rockefeller became governor of New York and vice president of the United States. David Rockefeller became the powerful chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. Winthrop was elected governor of Arkansas. John D. III focused on philanthropy, and Lawrence became a leading venture capitalist and conservationist. Through a complex network of trusts and foundations, the family fortune was protected and passed down through the generations. But more than just the money, it was an ethos of responsibility, what John Jr. called the belief that every right implies a responsibility, every opportunity an obligation, every possession a duty. That defined the dynasty. Today, 7 generations later, the Rockefeller family name still carries incredible weight. The family's foundations continue to be major forces in global philanthropy, working on everything from climate change to public health. So who was John D. Rockefeller? Was he the visionary captain of industry who brought order to chaos, lowered the cost of light for millions, and pioneered the modern corporation? Or was he the ruthless robber baron who crushed his competitors, corrupted politics with his money, and made a joke of the free market? The truth is, he was both. He was a product of the Gilded Age, an era of explosive growth and brutal, unrestrained capitalism. He was a man of deep contradictions, a devout Baptist who showed no mercy in business, a loving family man whose company destroyed the families of his rivals, and a monopolist who became the greatest philanthropist the world had ever seen. His story is more than just a biography, it's a foundational myth of American capitalism. It's a story about the terrifying power of unchecked ambition, the complicated relationship between wealth and morality, and the question of what the rich owe to the society that made them rich. The oil empire he built was eventually broken apart, but the dynasty he founded and the philanthropic model he created continue to shape our world in ways we can still see and feel today. The shadow of John D. Rockefeller, saint and sinner, creator and destroyer, is very long indeed. If you found this story of ambition and power fascinating, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history's most influential figures, and let us know in the comments, was John D. Rockefeller a hero or a villain? Thanks for watching.